The fire had long since died when Airless Morvain first understood that hunger was not temporary, but a condition of existence. She was 7 years old, crouched in the corner of a crumbling stone hut in Skelthar Vale, watching her mother's chest rise and fall with increasing difficulty. The woman had given Airless the last of the dried meat 3 days prior, claiming she had already eaten, though the hollow of her cheeks told a different story. When her mother finally stopped breathing on a frost-laden morning, Airless did not cry. She had learned by then that tears were a luxury, something that required energy her body could not spare. The Vale was a place where mercy died young. Nestled between jagged mountain peaks that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky, it was a borderland that belonged to no kingdom, no lord, no law. Humans lived there because they had been driven from everywhere else, because they were too poor, too broken, or too hunted to survive in civilized lands. They built their lives on frozen soil, trapping animals whose pelts they sold to traveling merchants, digging roots from ground so hard it split their fingernails, and praying that winter would not last forever, though it always seemed to. Airless's father had died 2 years before her mother, crushed beneath a rockslide while hunting in the upper passes. She remembered him only as a shadow, a figure who left before dawn and returned after dark, smelling of blood and exhaustion. After her mother's death, Airless was taken in by a woman named Grith, who ran a small trading post near the center of the Vale's largest settlement, a cluster of 40 hovels and one common hall built from blackened timber. Grith was not kind. She was a woman whose face had been carved by hardship into something resembling stone, and she made it clear from the first night that Airless would earn her keep or sleep in the cold. Airless was given a straw mat in the corner of the storage room, a space so narrow she could touch both walls if she stretched her arms, and she was put to work sorting pelts, gutting fish, and hauling water from the frozen creek that ran through the Vale. Grith did not beat her often, but when she did, it was with a methodical efficiency that left no visible marks, only bruises that bloomed purple beneath Airless's threadbare clothes. The settlement was ruled, insofar as anything could be ruled in such a place, by a man named Torvin Breck. He was not a lord or a mayor, but simply the largest, meanest, and most cunning of the hunters, and he had declared himself the arbiter of disputes and the keeper of order. Torvin lived in the common hall, a structure twice the size of any other building, where he held court every 10 days, listening to grievances, settling arguments over trap lines, and meting out punishment to those who violated the few rules the Vale observed. Airless learned quickly to stay out of his sight. Torvin had a habit of watching the young girls who passed through the settlement, his gaze lingering too long, his smile too wide. More than one woman had whispered that his justice was dispensed with a particular cruelty toward those who could not fight back. Airless grew up in that environment, her childhood a series of small survivals. She learned to move quietly, to make herself invisible, to read the moods of adults by the set of their shoulders and the tone of their voices. She learned which roots could be eaten and which would make you vomit blood, which animal tracks to follow and which to avoid, which lies to tell, and when silence was the only safe response. By the time she was 12, she was accompanying Grith on trading runs to the outer trap lines, carrying packs nearly as heavy as herself through snow that reached her thighs. By 14, she was guiding small caravans through the mountain passes, her knowledge of the terrain surpassing that of men twice her age. By 16, she had her own small trade in herbal remedies, brewing tinctures from bone lichen and frost root that eased pain and staved off infection, selling them for copper coins that she hid beneath a loose stone in Grith's storage room. But survival was not the same as safety, and Airless lived every day with the knowledge that she was one misstep away from disaster. The Vale was not a place that forgave weakness. When a trapper named Ulrich broke his leg in a fall and could no longer work, the settlement left him to starve, reasoning that food was too scarce to waste on the useless. When a young woman named Senna was found stealing bread from the common stores, Torvin had her stripped and tied to a post in the center of the settlement, where she remained for 2 days in the freezing wind as punishment. Senna survived, but her fingers turned black with frostbite, and she lost 3 of them to the healer's blade. Airless watched these things happen and understood that the world was divided into those who held power and those who endured it, and that she belonged to the latter category entirely. When Erlis was 19, Grith died of a fever that ravaged the settlement one brutal winter, and Erlis found herself alone again. She inherited nothing, for Grith had no possessions worth claiming, but she kept the storage room as her shelter and continued her work as a guide and herbalist. The settlement tolerated her presence because she was useful, but she was never accepted, never welcomed. The other women viewed her with suspicion, as though her solitary nature was evidence of some hidden defect, while the men saw her as either a potential laborer or a potential target, depending on their temperament. Erlis kept to herself, speaking only when necessary, and built her life around the principle that independence was the only protection she could rely on. It was during this time that Torvin's attention turned toward her. She had avoided him for years, but as she grew older and her skills became more valuable, he began to insert himself into her affairs. He demanded a portion of her earnings from guiding work, claiming it was a tax for using the settlement's trails. He insisted that she report to him personally whenever she returned from the mountains, ostensibly to provide information about conditions in the passes, but in truth, to remind her that he controlled her access to trade. Erlis complied, hating every moment, knowing that refusal would mean exile or worse. Torvin never touched her, but his threat was implicit in every interaction, a predator circling just outside striking distance, waiting for the right moment. The settlement's relationship with the wolves was one of uneasy coexistence punctuated by outbursts of violence. The wolves had always been present in the mountains, but they kept to the deep forests and high ridges, avoiding human settlements except during the harshest winters when prey grew scarce. The older hunters spoke of the wolves with a mixture of fear and respect, claiming that they were not ordinary beasts, but something older, something that understood the mountains in a way humans never could. But in recent years, a new generation of trappers had arrived in the Vale, men who had been driven north by war and famine in the southern kingdoms. These men had no respect for the old ways. They saw the wolves as competition, as threats to their trap lines and their livestock, and they began hunting them with a ruthless efficiency that appalled even the hardened residents of the Vale. The newcomers used packs of iron-jawed hounds, massive beasts bred for killing, and they poisoned waterholes, set snares along game trails, and tracked wolf dens to slaughter entire litters. The wolves retaliated, attacking trap lines, killing livestock, and occasionally mauling a hunter who ventured too deep into their territory. The violence escalated through Erlis's early 20s, and the settlement became a place of constant tension, where every journey into the mountains carried the risk of encountering either wolves or the men who hunted them. Erlis tried to stay neutral, but neutrality was nearly impossible. The trappers demanded her knowledge of the terrain to help them locate wolf dens, while the older hunters muttered that the newcomers were bringing disaster down upon them all. Erlis was 26 when the night came that shattered her life into before and after. She had been hired to guide a small caravan of merchants through the northern pass, a journey that should have taken 3 days. The weather had been brutal, a late-season blizzard that turned the mountains into a white hell, and the caravan had been forced to shelter in a shallow cave for 2 nights while the wind howled outside. On the 3rd morning, as they finally began their descent, Erlis heard the distant baying of hounds. She recognized the sound immediately, the iron-jawed beasts used by the trappers, and her stomach tightened with dread. The merchants heard it too, and their nervous chatter filled the air. But Erlis said nothing, focusing on leading them down the treacherous slope as quickly as possible. They were halfway through a narrow ravine when Erlis saw the cub. It was huddled beneath an overhang of ice, a small gray creature no larger than a hunting dog, its fur matted with blood. The hounds were close, their baying growing louder, and Erlis knew without question that they were hunting this cub. The merchants hurried past, unwilling to stop, unwilling to risk involvement, but Erlis found herself frozen, staring at the terrified animal. She had seen wolves before, from a distance, but never one so young, so vulnerable. Its eyes met hers, and in that moment, she saw something that should not have been there. An intelligence, a pleading that was almost human. She made her choice without thinking. She shouted at the merchants to keep moving, then turned back toward the cub, She pulled the small axe from her belt and the flint striker from her pack, and she positioned herself between the cub and the approaching hounds. When the beasts rounded the corner, 3 of them, their jaws dripping saliva and their eyes wild with bloodlust, Airless struck the flint against stone, igniting a bundle of dry moss she had prepared. She held the flaming bundle aloft, shouting and swinging her axe, and the hounds hesitated, confused by the fire and the unexpected resistance. For a moment it seemed they might retreat, but then the largest of the 3 lunged at her, and Airless swung the axe with all her strength, catching the beast across the shoulder. The hound yelped and fell back, and the others, seeing their packmate injured, turned and fled. Airless stood there, panting, her hands shaking, the axe still raised. The cub was trembling behind her, and when she turned to look at it, she saw that it had not fled. It was watching her with those unsettling, intelligent eyes, and she realized with a strange certainty that it understood what she had done. She dropped the axe and collapsed to her knees, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave. It was only then that she felt the pain, a sharp, burning agony in her side. She looked down and saw the gash, deep and ragged, where one of the hounds had caught her with its claws during the struggle. Blood was soaking through her tunic, spreading across the fabric in a dark stain. She tried to stand, but her legs would not support her. She fell forward, catching herself on her hands, and the world spun around her. The cub approached cautiously, its small body low to the ground, and it nuzzled against her arm, a gesture that was both comforting and heartbreaking. Airless's vision blurred, and she felt the cold seeping into her bones, the same cold that had taken her mother, her father, everyone she had ever known. She thought, distantly, that this was a fitting end, dying in the snow to save a creature that the world would have preferred she let die. She thought of Torvin, of Grith, of the settlement that had never wanted her, and she felt a strange sense of relief that she would never have to return. She did not remember closing her eyes, but when she opened them again, she was being lifted. Strong arms held her, and she smelled something unfamiliar, a scent like pine and smoke and something deeper, something wild. She tried to speak, but no sound came out, and then the darkness took her again, pulling her down into a place where there was no pain, no cold, only silence. Airless woke to warmth. It was the first thing she noticed, the sensation of heat against her skin, so foreign after a lifetime of cold that she thought she must be dreaming. She opened her eyes slowly, her vision blurry, and saw a ceiling of rough stone above her, illuminated by the flickering light of a fire. She tried to sit up, but pain lanced through her side, and she gasped, falling back against the furs that cushioned her. Furs. She was lying on a pile of furs, thick and soft, more than she had ever seen in one place. She turned her head, slowly, and her breath caught in her throat. She was in a cave, but not like any cave she had sheltered in before. This was vast, the ceiling disappearing into shadow, and the walls were smooth, almost polished, as though shaped by something other than nature. The fire burned in a stone pit at the center of the space, and around it she saw them. Wolves. Not 1 or 2, but dozens, their bodies ranging from gray to black to white, their eyes reflecting the firelight as they watched her. They did not growl or advance. They simply watched, and the stillness of their gaze was more unnerving than any threat. And then she saw him. A man stood near the fire, his back to her, his shoulders broad and his posture radiating a controlled tension that reminded her of a predator at rest. He wore furs and leather, his dark hair tied back, and when he turned to look at her, Airless felt a jolt of fear so profound it nearly stopped her heart. His eyes were not human. They were amber, flecked with gold, and they held the same intelligence she had seen in the cub's gaze, but magnified 1,000-fold. This was not a man who lived among wolves. This was something else entirely. He approached slowly, and Airless tried to push herself up, tried to reach for a weapon she no longer had, but her body would not obey. He stopped a few paces away, and when he spoke, his voice was low and rough, like gravel grinding together. "You are awake," he said, and it was not a question, but a statement of fact. Airless stared at him, her mind racing, trying to understand where she was, what had happened, whether she was a prisoner or a guest or something else entirely. The man tilted his head slightly, studying her, and she saw something flicker in his expression, something that might have been curiosity or confusion. "You saved the cub," he said, and again it was a statement, not a question. Airless nodded, not trusting her voice. The man was silent for a long moment, and then he said, "Why?" The question hung in the air, simple and yet impossible to answer. Why had she saved the cub? Because it was helpless? Because she had seen something in its eyes that reminded her of herself? Because in that moment, she had been given a choice, and for once in her life, she had chosen something other than survival? She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the man turned away, as though her answer did not matter. He walked to the edge of the firelight and stood there, his silhouette framed by the flames, and Airless understood with a cold certainty that she was not free to leave. She was in a place that should not exist, surrounded by creatures that should not tolerate her presence, and the man who had saved her life was as much a mystery as the wolves that watched her with unblinking eyes. She closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her, and she wondered if she had merely traded one kind of death for another. Airless did not know how many days passed in that strange, firelit darkness. Time lost its shape, becoming something fluid and unmeasurable, marked only by the alternating cycles of waking and sleeping, of pain and the gradual lessening of pain. She learned that the cave was not a cave at all, but a vast network of chambers, carved into the heart of the Black Pine Cliffs, a place hidden so deeply within the mountains that no human had ever found it, or if they had not lived to speak of it. The wolves moved through the passages with silent grace, appearing and disappearing like shadows, and Airless understood that this was their domain, a kingdom built in stone and secrecy. The man who had saved her was named Rhaegorn Valkar, though she did not learn this until her third day of consciousness, when a woman came to tend her wounds. The woman was small and wiry, her hair gray and her hands marked by scars, and she moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with injury and illness. She said nothing as she unwrapped the bandages around Airless's side, her expression unreadable. But when Airless gasped at the pain, the woman's eyes softened slightly. "The king's healers kept you alive," she said, her voice rough but not unkind. "You should have died from this wound. The hound's claws were poisoned." Airless stared at her, trying to process the words. "The king?" she whispered, and the woman nodded. "Rhaegorn Valkar, Alpha King of the North Wolves. You are in his stronghold, and you live because he commanded it." The woman paused, her hands still working to clean the wound, and then she added, almost to herself, "Though there are many who question his wisdom in this." Airless wanted to ask what she meant, but the woman finished her work in silence and left before Airless could form the question. Rhaegorn himself appeared infrequently, always at the edges of her awareness, a presence felt more than seen. She would wake to find him standing near the fire, his gaze fixed on something she could not perceive, or she would catch glimpses of him moving through the passages, his form shifting in ways that should have been impossible. Once, she woke in the deep hours of the night and saw him sitting across the chamber, his eyes reflecting the dying embers like twin flames. And she realized with a shock that he was not entirely human in that moment, that something lupine lurked just beneath his skin. He did not speak to her during these visits, and she did not speak to him, both of them locked in a silence that felt heavier than words. As her strength returned, Airless began to explore the limits of her confinement. She was not chained or restrained, but she understood instinctively that she was not free to leave. Wolves watched her constantly, their gazes following her every movement, and though they never threatened her, their presence was a reminder that she existed here only by permission. The chamber where she slept opened onto a larger hall, and beyond that, she could see tunnels branching in multiple directions, their depths illuminated by strange, luminescent fungi that grew on the walls. The air smelled of earth and pine and something else, something wild and indefinable that made her skin prickle with awareness. She saw other humans occasionally, men and women who moved through the stronghold with purpose, their expressions guarded. They did not speak to her, but she caught their sidelong glances, their whispered conversations that fell silent when she drew near. She overheard fragments of their words, enough to understand that her presence was controversial, that there were factions within this hidden kingdom who believed she should not have been saved, that a human who had touched the Alpha King's bloodline could not be trusted to live. Airless did not know what that meant, but she felt the weight of their suspicion, the way they avoided her as though she carried some contagion. On the seventh day, Rhaegorn finally spoke to her directly. She had been standing near the entrance to her chamber, watching the wolves move through the hall, when he appeared beside her so silently that she started. "You are healing well," he said, his voice low and measured, and Airless nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He was close enough that she could see the details of his face, the sharp angles of his jaw, the scar that ran from his temple to his cheekbone, the way his amber eyes seemed to see through her rather than at her. "You should not have survived," he continued, and there was something in his tone that she could not decipher, something that might have been accusation or wonder or both. "Why did you save me?" Airless asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Rhaegorn was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the wolves in the hall, and when he finally answered, his voice was almost too quiet to hear. "Because you saved what was mine," he said. "The cub you protected is my sister's son. He should not have been in the lowlands, but he is young and reckless, and he wandered too far. When I found you, you were dying to protect him, and I could not let that debt go unpaid." Airless absorbed this, her mind racing. "Your sister's son," she repeated, and then tentatively, "You are not human." It was not a question, but Rhaegorn answered anyway. "No," he said simply. "I am wolf-born. We are the first children of this land, and we have ruled these mountains since before your kind learned to make fire. You have entered a world that was never meant to be seen by human eyes, and now you are bound to it, whether you wish it or not." The words sent a chill through her, but before she could respond, a commotion erupted in the hall beyond. Voices rose in anger, and Rhaegorn's posture shifted instantly, his body tensing like a drawn bow. He moved away from her without another word, and Airless followed, drawn by curiosity and dread. The hall was filled with wolves and wolf-born now, their forms shifting fluidly between human and beast, and at the center of the gathering stood a group of figures who radiated authority. One of them, a tall woman with silver hair and eyes like ice, stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over Airless with open contempt. "This is the human," the woman said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "This is the one you brought into our stronghold, Rhaegorn. This is the one you allowed to see our faces, to learn our secrets." She turned to address the gathered wolves, her tone rising. "The laws are clear. No human who knows of our existence can be permitted to live. It does not matter that she saved the cub. It does not matter that she acted with honor. She is a threat to us all, and she must be dealt with." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Airless felt her pulse quicken, her hands clenching into fists. She wanted to run, to fight, to do something, but she was surrounded, outnumbered, and unarmed. Rhaegorn stepped between her and the silver-haired woman, his stance protective, and when he spoke, his voice was edged with steel. "Kaelith, you overstep. I am the Alpha King, and I make the laws here. This human lives because I have decreed it, and no council, no elder, will countermand my word." Kaelith's eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer, her body radiating hostility. "You would risk us all for a human. You would ignore centuries of law, of wisdom, because you feel some fleeting debt. This is not mercy, Rhaegorn. This is weakness, and weakness will destroy us." The tension in the hall was palpable, the air thick with the promise of violence, and Airless realized that she was watching a struggle for power, a challenge to Rhaegorn's authority that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with her. Rhaegorn did not move, did not flinch, but Airless saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands curled into fists. "I am not asking for your approval, Kaelith," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I am telling you what will be. This human has proven herself worthy of protection, and I will not allow her to be harmed. If you wish to challenge me, then do so openly, but know that I will not yield." The silence that followed was absolute, and then Kalith turned away, her expression cold and unreadable. "We will see, Rhaegorn," she said softly. "We will see how long your mercy lasts." She strode from the hall, and the other wolves followed, their departure leaving an emptiness that felt heavier than their presence. Rhaegorn remained where he was, his back to Airlis, and she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself as though bracing for a blow. "You should not have done that," Airlis said, her voice barely audible. Rhaegorn turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw something unguarded in his expression, a flicker of doubt or fear or exhaustion. "Perhaps not," he said, "but it is done." He walked away, leaving Airlis alone in the hall, surrounded by the echoes of a conflict she did not fully understand, but knew would shape her fate. The days that followed were tense and uncertain. Airlis was no longer confined to her chamber, but she was not welcome in most parts of the stronghold. She moved through the passages like a ghost, avoiding the gazes of the Wolfborn who watched her with suspicion or hostility. She learned to navigate the labyrinthine tunnels, memorizing the turns and junctions, driven by an instinct that told her knowledge was the only advantage she had. She discovered chambers filled with stores of dried meat and grain, workshops where weapons were forged, and vast caverns where the wolves gathered to howl in unison, their voices rising in a harmony that made her chest ache with something she could not name. She also learned more about Rhaegorn, though not from him. The healer who tended her wounds, whose name was Mira, proved to be more talkative than most, and over the course of several visits, she shared fragments of the Alpha King's history. Rhaegorn had ruled for 12 years, taking the throne at the age of 22 after his father had been killed in a war with a rival pack. He had been young and untested, and many had doubted his ability to lead, but he had proven himself through a combination of strategic brilliance and sheer ruthlessness. He had united the fractured wolf clans, driven out the rival packs, and established the stronghold beneath the Black Pine Cliffs as a sanctuary. But the cost had been high. He had lost his mother and 2 siblings in the wars, and the scars he carried, both visible and invisible, were reminders of battles fought and sacrifices made. "He does not allow himself to be vulnerable," Mira said one evening as she changed Airlis's bandages. "He believes that any sign of weakness will invite challenge, and he is right. There are those who would take his throne if they sensed an opening, and so he carries his burdens alone." She paused, her expression thoughtful. "Saving you was a risk, and not just because you are human. It showed compassion, and compassion is seen as a liability among our kind. Kalith and her allies will use this against him if they can." Airlis absorbed this information, her mind turning over the implications. "Why did he really save me?" she asked. "It cannot be just because of the cub. There must be something more." Mira hesitated, and then she said quietly, "There is an old belief among our people, a superstition that some dismiss but others hold sacred. It is said that when a human shows mercy to one of our young, when they choose to protect rather than harm, it is a sign of balance, of a connection that transcends the divide between our kinds. Rhaegorn is not a superstitious man, but he is a king, and kings must consider all possibilities, even those that seem impossible." Airlis did not know what to make of this, but she felt a strange stirring in her chest, a sense that her fate and Rhaegorn's were entangled in ways she could not yet see. She thought of the cub, of the moment she had chosen to stand between it and the hounds, and she wondered if that choice had set her on a path from which there was no return. Her days took on a rhythm, shaped by healing and observation. She helped Mira with small tasks, grinding herbs and preparing poultices, work that reminded her of her life in the Vale and gave her a sense of purpose. She avoided the more populated areas of the stronghold, but she could not avoid Rhaegorn entirely. He appeared at unpredictable intervals, sometimes watching her from a distance, sometimes speaking to her in brief, clipped exchanges that revealed little. He asked about her life in the Vale, and she told him, though she downplayed the worst of it, not out of pride, but because she did not want his pity. He listened without comment, his expression unreadable, and she wondered what he thought of her, whether he saw her as a burden or a curiosity, or something else entirely. One night, unable to sleep, Airless wandered deeper into the stronghold than she had ventured before. She followed a passage that sloped downward, the air growing colder and damper as she descended, until she emerged into a cavern so vast it took her breath away. The ceiling was invisible in the darkness above, and the floor was a sheet of black ice, smooth and reflective. At the center of the cavern stood a structure, a cairn of stones piled higher than a man, and around it she saw offerings, bones, feathers, scraps of cloth, tokens left by those who had come before. "This is the heart of our world," Rhaegorn's voice said from behind her, and Airless spun around, her heart racing. He stood at the entrance to the cavern, his figure backlit by the glow of the fungi, and he moved toward her with slow, deliberate steps. "This is where our ancestors are honored, where the bond between land and wolf is strongest. You should not be here, but since you are, you should understand what it means." He gestured to the cairn. "Every stone represents a life given to protect our people. Every offering is a promise that we will not forget." Airless stared at the cairn, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her. "You have lost so much," she said quietly, and Rhaegorn's expression hardened. "We have," he agreed, "and we will lose more before this is finished. Your kind is spreading, pushing into lands that were never yours, destroying what you do not understand. The humans who hunt us now are only the beginning. Soon there will be armies, campaigns, a war that will not end until one side is exterminated." He looked at her, and his gaze was filled with something bleak and terrible. "That is why Calith wants you dead, because you are a symbol of everything we fear, and symbols are powerful." Airless met his gaze, refusing to look away. "I am not your enemy," she said, and Rhaegorn's lips curved into something that might have been a smile but held no warmth. "No," he said, "but you are not my ally either. You are something in between, and in times like these, there is no room for ambiguity." He turned and walked away, leaving Airless alone in the cavern, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the uncertainty of the future. The turning point came a week later, when word reached the stronghold that human militias were gathering in Skelter Vale. The trappers who had been hunting wolves had formed an alliance, pooling their resources and recruiting fighters from the southern settlements. They were planning a campaign to exterminate the wolf population entirely, driven by fear and greed and the belief that the mountains belonged to them by right. The news sent shockwaves through the stronghold, and the council convened immediately, their voices raised in heated debate over how to respond. Airless was not invited to the council, but she heard the echoes of their arguments from the passage outside the chamber where they met. Some called for immediate retaliation, for descending on the Vale and slaughtering the militias before they could organize. Others advocated for retreat, for abandoning the lowlands entirely and withdrawing deeper into the mountains. And a few, Calith among them, argued that the human in their midst was a spy, that she had somehow communicated with her people and betrayed the stronghold's location. The accusation was absurd, but Airless knew that absurdity mattered little when fear ruled. When the council finally ended, Rhaegorn emerged looking more exhausted than she had ever seen him. He found her in the passage, and without a word, he gestured for her to follow him. They walked in silence through the tunnels until they reached a small chamber near the edge of the stronghold, a place where the walls opened onto a narrow ledge overlooking the forest below. The night was clear, the stars scattered across the sky like shards of ice, and the wind carried the scent of pine and snow. "They want me to kill you," Rhaegorn said, his voice flat. "Calith has convinced half the council that you are a threat, that your presence here endangers us all. They have given me an ultimatum: execute you, or they will take matters into their own hands." He paused, staring out at the forest. "I have until tomorrow night to decide." Airless felt the words like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What will you do?" she asked, and Rhaegorn turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "I do not know," he admitted. "If I defy the council, I risk civil war. If I allow them to kill you, I betray the principle that brought you here. There is no good choice, only degrees of failure. They stood in silence, the wind howling around them. And then Airless said, "There is another option." Rhaegorn raised an eyebrow, and she continued, her voice steady. "Bind me to the wolves. Make me part of your people in a way that the council cannot deny. I do not know your laws, but there must be some ritual, some rite that would make me untouchable." She saw the surprise in his eyes, the flicker of something that might have been hope or despair. "You would agree to that?" he asked. "To be bound to us, to give up your humanity, your freedom, everything you were?" Airless thought of the Vale, of Torvin and Grith, and the settlement that had never been home. She thought of the life she had lived, a life of cold and hunger and constant fear, and she realized that she had nothing to give up that was worth keeping. "Yes," she said, "I would." Rhaegorn stared at her for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly as though coming to a decision. "Very well," he said. "Tomorrow we will perform the binding, and whatever comes after, we will face it together." The ritual was held at midnight in the Cavern of Ancestors, the vast chamber where Airless had first glimpsed the Cairn of Stones. She had been brought there by Mira, who had dressed her in robes of undyed wool and placed a circlet of woven pine branches on her head. The healer had said nothing during the preparation, her face grave, and Airless had not asked questions, sensing that silence was the only appropriate response to what was about to unfold. Now she stood at the edge of the black ice, watching as the Wolfborn gathered in the shadows, their eyes reflecting the light of torches that had been placed around the cairn. Rhaegorn stood at the center of the circle, his form towering and imposing, dressed in furs that seemed to merge with the darkness around him. Beside him was an ancient woman, so old that her skin resembled parchment stretched over bone, her eyes milky with cataracts, but still somehow seeing. This was Valdra, the Keeper of Oaths, the one who remembered the old laws and presided over rituals that dated back to the first days of the Wolfborn. She raised a gnarled hand, and the murmuring of the gathered wolves fell silent, the cavern becoming so still that Airless could hear the drip of water echoing from somewhere in the depths. "We are gathered to witness a binding," Valdra said, her voice thin and reedy, but carrying with it an authority that silenced all doubt. "A human has asked to be joined to the Wolfborn, to forsake her kind and become one of ours. This is a sacred act, one that has not been performed in 3 generations, and it requires the consent of the Alpha King and the acceptance of the blood." She turned her blind gaze toward Airless, and though she could not see, Airless felt the weight of her scrutiny. "Step forward, human, and speak your intent." Airless walked across the ice, her bare feet numb from the cold, and she stopped before Valdra and Rhaegorn. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady despite the fear that coiled in her chest. "I am Airless Morvain, and I ask to be bound to the Wolfborn. I ask to be accepted as one of your people, to share your burdens and your fate. I offer my life in exchange for sanctuary, and I swear that I will never betray the secrets I have learned." Valdra nodded slowly, and then she turned to Rhaegorn. "And you, Alpha King? Do you accept this binding? Do you take responsibility for this human, for her actions and her fate, as though she were born of your own blood?" Rhaegorn's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Airless thought he might refuse, might turn away and leave her to face the council's judgment alone. But then he spoke, his voice resonating through the cavern. "I accept," he said. "I take responsibility for Airless Morvain, and I bind her to my protection and my authority. Let any who would harm her face me first." The words hung in the air, and Airless saw the ripple of reaction that passed through the gathered wolves. Some nodded in approval, while others exchanged dark glances, their displeasure evident. Calith stood near the back of the crowd, her expression cold and unreadable, and Airless knew that this act would only deepen the rift between her and Rhaegorn. But there was no turning back now. Valdra gestured for Airless to kneel, and she did, her knees pressing against the ice, the cold seeping into her bones. Valdra produced a knife, its blade black and gleaming, forged from a metal Airless did not recognize. She held it aloft, chanting in a language that predated human speech. a guttural, rhythmic cadence that seemed to resonate with the stone itself. Then she turned to Rhaegorn and made a shallow cut across his palm, the blood welling up dark and thick. She did the same to Aerys, and the pain was sharp and immediate, but Aerys did not flinch. Valdra pressed their hands together, their blood mingling, and she bound them with a strip of leather, tying the knot with practiced efficiency. "Blood calls to blood," Valdra intoned. "What was separate is now joined. What was human is now wolf. Let the bond be sealed in flesh and spirit, and let none break what has been made whole." She released their hands, and Rhaegorn pulled Aerys to her feet, his grip strong and unyielding. The wolves began to howl, their voices rising in a chorus that filled the cavern and echoed out into the night, a sound so primal and powerful that Aerys felt it vibrate through her entire body. She wanted to cover her ears, to run, but Rhaegorn held her in place, his eyes locked on hers, and she saw something in his gaze that steadied her, something that might have been reassurance or challenge or both. When the howling finally ceased, Valdra spoke again. "It is done. Aerys Morvayn is no longer human. She is wolf-born, bound by blood and oath to Rhaegorn Valkar and to the Pack. Let all who witness this remember, and let none dare to question what has been decreed." The old woman turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the shadows, and the gathered wolves began to disperse, their murmurs filling the cavern once more. Rhaegorn released Aerys's hand, and she looked down at the cut on her palm, already beginning to clot, the blood drying in a thin line. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible, and Rhaegorn's expression was grim. "Now we see if the binding holds," he said. "The ritual is symbolic, but symbols have power among our kind. You are under my protection, but that does not mean you are safe. There will be those who test the bond, who seek to prove that it is a sham. You will need to prove yourself, to show that you are worthy of the claim I have made." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the cavern. "And you will need to learn our ways, to understand what it means to be wolfborn. Mira will teach you, and you will obey her, as you would obey me." Aerys nodded, too exhausted to argue, and Rhaegorn gestured for her to follow him. They left the cavern, climbing back through the passages to the upper levels of the stronghold, and he led her to a new chamber, larger than the one she had occupied before, with a hearth and a bed piled high with furs. "This is yours now," he said. "You are no longer a prisoner, but you are not free to leave. The binding has made you part of the Pack, and the Pack does not abandon its own." He turned to go, but Aerys reached out, her hand catching his arm. "Thank you," she said, and Rhaegorn looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Do not thank me yet," he said quietly. "You do not know what you have agreed to." He pulled away and left, the door closing behind him with a finality that made Aerys's chest tighten. She stood alone in the chamber, staring at the fire, and she wondered if she had just saved her life or condemned herself to something far worse. The days following the binding were a trial unlike any Aerys had faced before. Mira became her constant companion, teaching her the language of the wolfborn, a complex system of gestures, growls, and subtle shifts in posture that conveyed meaning beyond words. Aerys struggled at first, her human instincts clashing with the instinctual communication of the wolves, but Mira was patient, correcting her mistakes with a combination of firmness and encouragement. She learned to read the moods of the Pack, to recognize the hierarchy in the way they moved and interacted, to understand that every gesture carried weight and consequence. She also learned the history of the wolfborn, the stories that Mira shared during their long hours together. The wolfborn were not a separate species, but humans who had been transformed through an ancient pact with the spirits of the land, a bond forged in blood and sacrifice that granted them the ability to shift between forms. The transformation was not a gift, but a burden, passed down through generations, and those who bore it were both blessed and cursed. They were stronger, faster, more resilient than ordinary humans, but they were also bound to the land in ways that made them vulnerable to its corruption and decay. The wolves they commanded were not mere animals, but extensions of their will, creatures that shared their consciousness and carried fragments of their souls. "Rhaegorn," Mira explained, was the most powerful of the Wolfborn because he carried the blood of the first Alpha, the one who had made the original pact. His ability to command the wolves was absolute, his connection to the land unbreakable, but the price he paid was isolation. The more powerful an Alpha became, the more they were separated from ordinary emotion, forced to prioritize the survival of the pack over personal desire or attachment. It was why Rhaegorn seemed so distant, so detached, and why his decision to save Airless had been so shocking to the Council. It was an act of individuality in a world that demanded conformity, and it had marked him as vulnerable in the eyes of those who sought to challenge his rule. Airless absorbed these lessons, her understanding of Rhaegorn deepening with each revelation. She began to see him not as a king, but as a man trapped by his own power, carrying burdens that would have crushed anyone else. She watched him from a distance, observing the way he moved through the stronghold, the way he listened to the grievances of his people, the way he made decisions with a cold pragmatism that left no room for doubt. He was admired and feared in equal measure, and she realized that he had no true allies, only subordinates who followed him because they had no better alternative. Their interactions remained infrequent, but when they did speak, Airless found herself drawn to him in ways she could not explain. There was a magnetism to Rhaegorn, a presence that filled any space he occupied, and she felt it most acutely when they were alone. He asked her questions about the Vale, about the militias that were gathering, and she answered truthfully, sharing what she knew of their tactics and their leaders. She could see the calculations running behind his eyes, the way he pieced together information like a puzzle, and she realized that he was preparing for war, that the conflict she had witnessed brewing was about to erupt into violence. One evening, as she sat in her chamber working on a set of leather bindings that Mira had asked her to repair, Rhaegorn appeared in the doorway. He did not knock or announce himself, simply stepped inside and closed the door behind him, and Airless looked up, startled. "I need your help," he said without preamble, and she set aside the leather, giving him her full attention. "The militias are planning to attack the lowland dens within the week. They have hired mercenaries from the south, men with experience fighting in organized campaigns, and they are armed with weapons designed to kill wolves. If they succeed, they will slaughter dozens of our young and destroy the dens that have sheltered our people for generations." Airless felt a chill run through her. "What do you need from me?" she asked, and Rhaegorn moved closer, his expression intense. "I need you to go back to the Vale," he said. "I need you to infiltrate the militias, to learn their plans, their numbers, their weaknesses. You know the terrain, you know the people, and you can move among them without suspicion. It is dangerous, and I would not ask if there were any other option, but you are the only one who can do this." The request hung in the air, and Airless felt the weight of it pressing down on her. To return to the Vale was to risk everything, to face the people who had cast her out, to place herself in the path of violence and hatred. But she also understood what Rhaegorn was offering her, a chance to prove herself, to demonstrate that the binding was more than symbolic, that she was truly one of the Wolfborn. She met his gaze, and she saw the doubt there, the fear that she would refuse, and something in her chest tightened. "I will do it," she said, and Rhaegorn's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his expression remained guarded. "You understand what you are agreeing to," he said. "If they discover what you are, they will kill you without hesitation. If you fail, the dens will be destroyed, and the war will escalate beyond anything we can control. There is no room for error." Airless nodded, her resolve hardening. "I understand," she said, "but I need something from you in return." Rhaegorn raised an eyebrow, and she continued, her voice steady. "I need to know that if I do this, if I risk my life for your people, you will trust me. Truly trust me. Not as a tool or a weapon, but as someone who belongs." Rhaegorn was silent for a long moment, and then he stepped closer, so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I do not trust easily," he said quietly. "I have seen too much betrayal, too much loss to allow myself that luxury. But you have given me no reason to doubt you, and that is more than I can say for most." He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, the touch so brief and unexpected that Airless barely had time to register it before he pulled away. "Go to the Vale," he said. "Learn what you can, and return to me. And if you succeed, I will give you what you ask." Airless left the stronghold before dawn, guided through the mountain passes by a young wolfborn named Kale, who spoke little but moved with the silent efficiency of someone who had spent their entire life in the wilderness. They traveled for 2 days, sleeping in shallow caves and eating dried meat that tasted of smoke and salt, until they reached the edge of the Vale. Kale left her there, melting back into the forest without a word, and Airless stood alone, staring down at the settlement she had once called home. It looked smaller than she remembered, the buildings more ramshackle, the people moving through the muddy streets with the same weary resignation she had carried for so many years. She pulled her hood low over her face and descended into the Vale, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She needed to blend in, to become invisible, and so she adopted the posture of someone defeated, someone too tired to be a threat. It worked. The few people who noticed her gave her only passing glances, dismissing her as just another refugee seeking shelter from the cold. She made her way to the common hall, where she knew the militias would be gathering, and she slipped inside, taking a seat in the shadows near the back. The hall was crowded, filled with men and women whose faces were hard and worn, and at the front, standing on a raised platform, was Torvin Breck. He looked older than she remembered, his hair graying at the temples, but his presence was as commanding as ever, and when he spoke, the room fell silent. "We have tolerated the wolves long enough," Torvin said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "They have killed our livestock, destroyed our traps, and driven us from lands that are rightfully ours. But no more. We have gathered here to put an end to this threat, to reclaim the mountains for humanity, and to send a message that we will not be cowed by beasts." He gestured to a map spread out on a table beside him, and Airless leaned forward, straining to see the details. "We have identified 3 dens in the lowlands, places where the wolves gather to raise their young. We will strike at dawn in 5 days, using fire and steel to flush them out, and we will show no mercy." A cheer rose from the crowd, and Airless felt her stomach turn. She had known the militias were planning an attack, but hearing the details, seeing the fervor in their eyes, made it real in a way that terrified her. She needed to learn more, to find out how many fighters they had, what weapons they carried, but she could not risk drawing attention to herself. She stayed in the hall until the meeting ended, then slipped out into the night, her mind racing. Over the next 3 days, Airless moved through the Vale like a shadow, gathering information piece by piece. She learned that the militias numbered over 100 fighters, many of them experienced hunters and trappers, and that they had acquired crossbows and poisoned bolts from southern merchants. She learned that they planned to split into 3 groups, each targeting a different den, and that they intended to set fire to the surrounding forest to prevent the wolves from escaping. She learned that Torvin had promised a bounty for every wolf pelt brought back, and that the fighters were motivated as much by greed as by fear. She also learned that she had not been forgotten. On the 4th day, as she sat in a small tavern nursing a cup of watered-down ale, she overheard 2 men talking in low voices at a nearby table. "Did you hear about Airless Morvain?" one of them said. "The tracker who disappeared a month ago. Someone said they saw her in the mountains, traveling with wolves. Torvin thinks she might have been taken by them, turned into some kind of thrall." The other man laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "If that's true, then she's as good as dead. No one survives contact with those beasts and comes back human." Airless kept her face neutral, but her pulse quickened. If Torvin suspected she was alive, if he thought she had been compromised, he might send hunters after her. She needed to finish her reconnaissance and return to the stronghold before anyone recognized her. She left the tavern and made her way to the edge of the settlement, where she had arranged to meet Kale at midnight. The young wolfborn was waiting for her, his form barely visible in the darkness, and when she approached, he gestured for her to follow without a word. They traveled through the night, moving faster than Airless would have thought possible, and by dawn, they were deep in the mountains, far from the Vale. Kyle finally spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "You found what you needed?" he asked. and Airless nodded. "I did," she said. "The militias will attack in 2 days. We need to warn the dens and prepare a defense." Kyle's expression darkened, and he picked up the pace, pushing them harder, and Airless followed, her body aching but her resolve unshaken. They reached the stronghold by midday, and Airless went directly to Rhaegorn, finding him in the war room, a chamber filled with maps and markers that represented the locations of dens, patrols, and known human settlements. She reported everything she had learned, her voice steady despite her exhaustion, and Rhaegorn listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each detail. When she finished, he stood and began issuing orders, calling for messengers to be sent to the lowland dens, for patrols to be doubled, for fighters to be assembled. "You have done well," he said to Airless, and there was something in his tone that made her chest tighten. "Better than I dared hope. The information you brought will save lives, and for that, you have my gratitude." He paused, and then he added, almost reluctantly, "You have also earned my trust." Airless met his gaze, and she saw the truth of it in his eyes, the acknowledgement that she was no longer an outsider but one of them. It was a small victory, but in that moment, it felt monumental. The stronghold transformed in the hours following Airless's return. What had been a place of relative calm became a hive of controlled chaos as Rhaegorn mobilized his forces. Messengers were dispatched to the lowland dens, carrying warnings and orders to evacuate the young and vulnerable to higher ground. Patrols were assembled and sent to scout the routes the militias would most likely use, with instructions to harass and delay but not engage in open combat. Weapons were distributed, strategies debated, and contingencies planned for every possible outcome. Airless watched it all unfold with a mixture of awe and dread, understanding that she had set these events in motion, that her information had triggered a response that could not be undone. Rhaegorn moved through the preparations with ruthless efficiency, his commands precise and his expectations clear. He was everywhere at once, inspecting weapons, questioning scouts, reviewing maps with his commanders. Airless saw him shift seamlessly between his human and wolf forms, using whichever was most practical for the task at hand, and she marveled at the ease with which he inhabited both states. But she also saw the toll it took, the way his shoulders tensed with each new report, the way his jaw tightened when a messenger brought news of delays or complications. He carried the weight of every decision, every life that hung in the balance, and she realized that leadership for him was not power, but burden. On the evening before the expected attack, Rhaegorn summoned Airless to the war room. She found him alone, staring at the map spread across the central table, his fingers tracing the markers that represented the 3 targeted dens. He looked up when she entered, and she saw exhaustion etched into the lines of his face, though his eyes remained sharp and focused. "Tomorrow will determine everything," he said without preamble. "If we can repel the militias, if we can show them that we are not easy prey, there is a chance they will retreat and reconsider their campaign. But if we fail, if even one den falls, the war will escalate beyond anything we can contain." Airless stepped closer to the table, studying the map. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, and Rhaegorn's expression shifted, something that might have been reluctance crossing his features. "I need you to stay here," he said, "in the stronghold, where you will be safe. The battle tomorrow will be brutal, and I cannot afford to worry about your safety while commanding my forces." Airless felt a surge of frustration, and she shook her head. "I did not come this far to hide while others fight," she said. "I know the terrain around the dens. I know how the militias think, and I can help. You said I earned your trust. Prove it by letting me fight beside you." Rhaegorn was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching her face, and then he sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "You are not a warrior, Airless. You have courage, but courage alone will not keep you alive in battle. If you insist on coming, you will stay close to me. You will follow my orders without question, and you will not take unnecessary risks. Do you understand?" Airless nodded, relief flooding through her. "I understand," she said, and Rhaegorn's expression softened slightly, though the worry did not leave his eyes. He moved around the table, standing close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence, and when he spoke again, his voice was low and rough. "I do not want to lose you," he said, and the words hung in the air between them, weighted with an intimacy that neither of them had acknowledged before. Airlis looked up at him, her breath catching, and she saw the conflict in his gaze, the way he held himself back even as something pulled him toward her. "You will not lose me," she said quietly. "I am stronger than I look, and I have survived worse than a battle." Rhaegarn reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his fierce exterior. "You have survived by hiding, by making yourself small and invisible," he said. "But tomorrow you will be seen, and you will be a target. The militias will not show mercy to someone they believe has betrayed them, and they will recognize you if they get close enough." Airlis leaned into his touch, her own hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "Then we will not let them get close," she said, and Rhaegarn's lips curved into something that was almost a smile. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, and for a moment, they stood like that, the chaos of the world outside fading into the background. Airlis felt something shift between them, a connection that went deeper than the binding ritual, deeper than obligation or gratitude. It was raw and undeniable, a pull that neither of them could ignore, and when Rhaegarn finally pulled away, she saw the same awareness in his eyes. "Get some rest," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Tomorrow will test us all, and I need you sharp." Airlis nodded, and as she left the war room, she felt the weight of what had passed between them settling into her chest, a promise unspoken but understood. She returned to her chamber, but sleep eluded her. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through everything that could go wrong, everything that could be lost. She thought of the Wolfborn she had met over the past weeks, the ones who had slowly begun to accept her presence, and she thought of the young in the dens, innocent and vulnerable, who would be slaughtered if the militias succeeded. She thought of Rhaegarn, standing alone in the war room, carrying the burden of leadership with no one to share it, and she wished she could ease his load, even if only for a moment. The attack came at dawn, just as Airlis had predicted. The militias moved in 3 coordinated groups, approaching the lowland dens from different directions, their movements calculated and precise. But Rhaegarn had anticipated their strategy, and the Wolfborn were ready. The dens had been evacuated during the night. The young and the vulnerable moved to hidden locations deeper in the mountains, and in their place, Rhaegarn had positioned his warriors, seasoned fighters who knew the terrain intimately and could use it to their advantage. Airlis stood beside Rhaegarn on a ridge overlooking one of the dens, watching as the first wave of militias emerged from the tree line. They carried torches and crossbows, their faces grim with determination, and they moved in tight formation, a disciplined advance that spoke of military training. Rhaegarn raised his hand, and the Wolfborn around him tensed, waiting for his signal. Airlis felt her pulse quicken, her hands gripping the knife Rhaegarn had given her, a weapon that felt inadequate against the violence about to unfold. Rhaegarn dropped his hand, and the Wolfborn attacked. They descended from the ridge in a wave of fur and fang, their movements so fast and coordinated that the militias barely had time to react. The crossbows fired, bolts whistling through the air, and several wolves fell, their bodies crumpling to the ground. But the rest pressed forward, crashing into the human lines with devastating force. Airlis watched in horror and awe as the battle erupted, the sounds of snarling, screaming, and clashing steel filling the air. Rhaegarn shifted into his wolf form, a massive beast with fur as black as night, and he led the charge, his presence commanding and terrifying. Airlis followed, staying close to Rhaegarn as he had instructed, her knife drawn and her senses heightened. She saw a militia fighter break through the Wolfborn lines, his torch raised to set fire to the den, and she moved without thinking, launching herself at him. She tackled him to the ground, the torch falling from his hand, and they struggled, his strength far greater than hers. He struck her across the face, and pain exploded through her skull, but she held on, driving her knife into his shoulder. He screamed and fell back, and Airlis scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking, blood dripping from the blade. Rhaegarn appeared beside her, his massive form standing between her and the retreating fighter. and he let out a growl that made the ground tremble. The militias were falling back, their formation broken, their fighters scattered and demoralized by the ferocity of the Wolfborn assault. But the victory was not complete. Airless saw smoke rising from the direction of the second den, and her heart sank. One of the groups had succeeded in setting the fire, and the flames were spreading rapidly, consuming the forest with terrifying speed. Rhaegorn shifted back to his human form, his body streaked with blood, and he turned to one of his commanders. "Take half the force to the second den," he ordered. "Contain the fire and drive the militias back. I will lead the rest to the third den and ensure they do not succeed there." The commander nodded and rallied a group of warriors, disappearing into the forest at a dead run. Rhaegorn looked at Airless, his expression grim. "Can you still fight?" he asked, and she nodded, though her body ached and her face throbbed from the blow she had taken. "Good," he said. "Stay close." They moved through the forest at a relentless pace, the Wolfborn flowing around them like shadows. And Airless pushed herself to keep up, her lungs burning and her legs trembling with exhaustion. They reached the third den just as the militias were beginning their assault, and Rhaegorn did not hesitate. He shifted again, leading a charge that crashed into the enemy lines with brutal efficiency. Airless saw Torvin in the midst of the fighters, his face twisted with rage, and their eyes met across the chaos. Recognition flared in his gaze, followed by fury, and he began to push toward her, his sword drawn. Airless knew she could not fight him, not directly, but she also knew she could not run. She stood her ground, her knife raised, and when Torvin reached her, he swung his sword with all his strength. She dodged barely, the blade slicing through the air where her head had been, and she stumbled, falling to one knee. Torvin loomed over her, his expression triumphant, and he raised his sword for the killing blow. But before he could strike, Rhaegorn was there, his human form interposing itself between them, his own blade catching Torvin's with a clash of steel. "She is under my protection," Rhaegorn said, his voice cold and deadly, and Torvin sneered. "She is a traitor," he spat. "She betrayed her own kind to serve beasts. She deserves to die." Rhaegorn's expression did not change, but Airless saw the fury in his eyes, the barely controlled violence that simmered just beneath the surface. "She chose a side," Rhaegorn said, "and so have you. Now face the consequences." He attacked, his movements precise and brutal, and Torvin was forced back, struggling to defend himself against the relentless assault. Airless watched, her heart in her throat, as the two men fought. Torvin was skilled, but Rhaegorn was something else entirely. A warrior honed by years of war and loss, and it showed in every strike, every parry, every calculated movement. The fight ended quickly, Rhaegorn disarming Torvin with a savage twist of his blade and driving him to his knees. He held his sword to Torvin's throat, and for a moment, Airless thought he would kill him, but then he lowered the blade and stepped back. "Go," Rhaegorn said. "Return to your settlement and tell them what you saw here. Tell them that the Wolfborn will not be driven from these mountains, and that any who try will face the same fate as your militias. Tell them that there is a price for their hatred, and that I am willing to exact it." Torvin staggered to his feet, his face pale, and he looked at Airless one last time, his expression filled with contempt and something that might have been fear. Then he turned and fled, disappearing into the forest, and the remaining militias followed, their attack broken and their morale shattered. The Wolfborn let them go, too exhausted and bloodied to pursue, and as the sounds of battle faded, Airless felt the adrenaline drain from her body, leaving her weak and shaking. She looked around at the carnage, at the bodies of Wolfborn and humans alike scattered across the ground, and she felt a wave of grief and guilt crash over her. This was the cost of survival, the price of choosing sides, and it was heavier than she had imagined. Rhaegorn approached her, his face grim, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You fought well," he said, and Airless shook her head. "I barely survived," she said. "I am not a warrior, Rhaegorn. I do not know if I can do this again." Rhaegorn's grip tightened, and he turned her to face him. "You do not have to be a warrior to be strong," he said. "You stood your ground when others would have fled, and you protected what mattered. That is courage, and it is more valuable than skill with a blade. They returned to the stronghold as the sun set, the Wolfborn carrying their wounded and their dead. The victory had been costly, and the mood was somber, the celebration muted by the awareness of what had been lost. Airlise helped Mira tend to the injured, her hands steady despite her exhaustion, and she worked through the night, stitching wounds and administering herbs, doing what she could to ease the suffering around her. Rhaegorn was everywhere, speaking to his warriors, honoring the fallen, making decisions about what came next, and Airless marveled at his resilience, at the way he carried on even when every part of him must have been screaming for rest. It was near dawn when he finally came to find her. She was sitting in the healing chamber, her hands stained with blood, her body aching. And when he appeared in the doorway, she looked up, too tired to speak. He crossed the room and knelt beside her, his expression soft in a way she had never seen before. "You need to rest," he said, and Airless shook her head. "There are still wounded who need care," she said, but Rhaegorn took her hands in his, stilling her movements. "They will be cared for," he said, "but you have done enough. You have given everything you have, and now you need to let others carry the burden." He pulled her to her feet, and she leaned against him, too exhausted to resist, and he led her back to her chamber. He helped her onto the bed, pulling the furs over her, and when she reached for his hand, he did not pull away. "Stay," she whispered, and Rhaegorn hesitated, his conflict visible in his eyes. But then he nodded and sat beside her, his hand holding hers as she drifted into sleep. When Airless woke, the light filtering through the chamber suggested it was late afternoon. Her body ached in ways she had not thought possible, every muscle protesting as she shifted on the bed. But the pain was manageable, a dull throb rather than the sharp agony of the previous day. She sat up slowly and found Rhaegorn still there, sitting in a chair beside the bed, his eyes closed but his posture alert, as though even in rest he remained vigilant. She watched him for a moment, taking in the harsh lines of his face, the scars that marked his skin, the way his shoulders carried the weight of a kingdom. As if sensing her gaze, Rhaegorn opened his eyes, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence between them filled with unspoken words. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice rough from lack of sleep, and Airless managed a faint smile. "Like I was trampled by a herd of elk," she said, "but alive." Rhaegorn's lips twitched, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him, and he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "The militias retreated to the Vale," he said. "Our scouts report that they are in disarray, arguing among themselves about whether to regroup or abandon the campaign entirely. Torvin survived, and he is spreading word of what happened, but the people are divided. Some want revenge, others want peace, and the settlement is fracturing under the weight of their fear." He paused, his gaze distant. "We have won a battle, but the war is far from over. The humans will not forget what happened here, and neither will we." Airless absorbed this, her mind turning over the implications. "What will you do?" she asked, and Rhaegorn's expression hardened. "I will fortify the stronghold and prepare for the next attack. I will send emissaries to the other wolf clans, seeking alliances and reinforcements, and I will ensure that the dens are rebuilt and the young are protected, no matter the cost." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "But I cannot do it alone. I need someone I can trust, someone who understands both worlds and can help me navigate the path forward. I need you, Airless." The words settled into her chest, heavy and undeniable, and Airless felt the full weight of what he was asking. To stand beside him was to commit herself fully to the Wolfborn, to accept that there was no going back to the life she had known. It was to embrace a future filled with uncertainty and danger, but it was also to claim a place where she belonged, where her choices mattered and her presence was valued. She met his gaze, and she nodded. "I am with you," she said. "Whatever comes, I am with you." Rhaegorn reached out, his hand cupping her face, and he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was both tender and fierce, a promise sealed in the quiet intimacy of the moment. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with something that might have been hope or fear or both. and Airless felt her heart swell with an emotion she could not name, but knew was profound and unshakable. The weeks that followed the battle were marked by an uneasy tension that permeated every corner of the stronghold. The Wolfborn had won a decisive victory, but the cost had been steep, and the knowledge that the conflict was far from over hung over them like a storm cloud. Rhaegorn threw himself into fortifying their defenses, organizing patrols, and reaching out to the scattered wolf clans that had maintained their distance from his rule. Airless worked alongside him, her days filled with meetings, strategy sessions, and the constant work of maintaining the fragile unity that held the Wolfborn together. Her relationship with Rhaegorn deepened during this time, though it remained complicated by the demands of leadership and the scrutiny of the pack. They stole moments together when they could, quiet conversations in the late hours of the night, shared meals in his private chambers, touches that lingered longer than necessary. But they were careful not to display their connection openly, aware that any perception of weakness or distraction would be seized upon by those who sought to undermine Rhaegorn's authority. Kaelith remained a constant threat, her opposition to Airless's presence growing more vocal with each passing day, and there were whispers among certain factions that the Alpha King had been compromised by his attachment to a human. Airless felt the weight of these whispers, the way some Wolfborn looked at her with suspicion or outright hostility, and she worked tirelessly to prove her worth. She used her knowledge of human tactics to help plan defensive strategies. She assisted Mira in training younger Wolfborn in the art of healing, and she volunteered for dangerous reconnaissance missions that took her back to the edges of the Vale. She wanted to show them that she was not a liability, but an asset, that her binding to the pack was more than symbolic. But no matter how hard she worked, she could not shake the feeling that she was walking a tightrope, that one misstep would send her plummeting into an abyss from which there was no return. The turning point came 6 weeks after the battle, when a messenger arrived at the stronghold with news that sent shockwaves through the assembled council. The human militias had regrouped, but they had done something unexpected. Instead of preparing for another assault, they had sent an emissary to request a meeting with the Alpha King. The messenger was a young woman named Sarah, someone Airless recognized from the Vale, and she carried a sealed letter bearing Torvin's mark. Rhaegorn read the letter in silence, his expression unreadable, and when he finished, he looked up at the council members gathered around him. "They want to negotiate," he said, and the words were met with an explosion of reaction. Some council members shouted that it was a trap, that the humans could not be trusted, while others argued that negotiation was preferable to endless war. Kaelith's voice rose above the others, sharp and cutting. "This is foolishness," she said. "The humans want only to buy time, to regroup and strike when we are unprepared. We should refuse their offer and prepare for the inevitable attack." Rhaegorn raised a hand, silencing the arguments, and his gaze swept over the council. "I will hear what they have to say," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We will meet on neutral ground, with adequate security, and we will listen. If their offer is genuine, we may be able to avoid further bloodshed. If it is a trap, we will be ready." He looked at Airless, who had been standing at the edge of the chamber, and he gestured for her to approach. "Airless will accompany me," he said. "She knows these people and she will help me determine whether their words can be trusted." The decision provoked another wave of protest, but Rhaegorn's authority was absolute, and the council had no choice but to accept his decree. Kaelith's eyes burned with fury as she stared at Airless, and Airless felt the full force of her hatred, but she held her ground, refusing to be intimidated. Rhaegorn dismissed the council, and when they were alone, he turned to Airless, his expression grave. "This is dangerous," he said. "If the humans see you with me, if they realize you have sided with the Wolfborn, they may view you as a traitor and refuse to negotiate. But I need you there. I need your insight, your ability to read them." Airless nodded, her resolve firm despite the fear that coiled in her stomach. "I understand," she said, "and I am willing to take the risk. If there is any chance of ending this conflict without more death, we have to try." Rhaegorn's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own, and for a moment, they stood in silence, drawing strength from each other. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "know that you have changed me. You have shown me that there is more to leadership than strength and control, that mercy and trust are not weaknesses but foundations. For that, I am grateful." The meeting was arranged for 3 days later, at a clearing in the forest that lay halfway between the stronghold and the Vale. Rhaegorn brought a contingent of his best warriors, 20 Wolfborn who moved through the trees like shadows, their presence both a deterrent and a promise of violence if betrayal occurred. Aerys rode beside Rhaegorn, her heart pounding as they approached the clearing, and when they emerged from the tree line, she saw the human delegation waiting. Torvund stood at the center of the group, flanked by a dozen armed men, and behind them, Aerys saw others from the Vale, people she recognized, people who had once been her neighbors. Their expressions were hard and suspicious, and when they saw her standing beside Rhaegorn, she heard the murmurs of shock and anger that rippled through their ranks. Torvund's face darkened, his jaw clenching, but he did not speak, waiting for Rhaegorn to make the first move. Rhaegorn dismounted, his movements deliberate and controlled, and he walked forward until he stood at the edge of the clearing, Aerys at his side. "You requested this meeting," he said, his voice carrying across the space between them. "I am here to listen. Speak your terms." Torvund stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, and he glared at Aerys before turning his attention to Rhaegorn. "We come to offer a truce," he said, his voice rough. "The people of the Vale have suffered enough. We have lost fighters, resources, and hope, and we cannot sustain this war. We propose a division of territory. The mountains above the timberline will remain yours, and the lowlands will be ours. We will not hunt your kind if you do not raid our settlements." Rhaegorn listened without expression, and when Torvund finished, he was silent for a long moment. "And what guarantee do I have that you will honor this truce?" he asked. "What is to stop you from regrouping and attacking again when you believe you have the advantage?" Torvund's expression tightened, and he gestured to the men behind him. "We will swear an oath, binding ourselves to the terms. Any who break the truce will be cast out from the Vale and left to face your justice." Rhaegorn considered this, his gaze flicking to Aerys, and she saw the question in his eyes. She stepped forward, her voice calm despite the hostility radiating from the human delegation. "The Vale is desperate," she said. "They have lost too much to continue fighting, and Torvund knows that another assault will break them entirely. But he is also proud, and he will not admit defeat openly. This truce is a way for him to save face while securing the survival of his people." She looked at Torvund, and their eyes met, a lifetime of shared history passing between them. "He will honor it, not because he trusts you, but because he has no other choice." Torvund's face flushed with anger, but he did not contradict her, and Rhaegorn nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "I will accept your truce, but with conditions. The division of territory will be as you propose, but we will establish neutral zones where neither side may enter without the other's permission. Any violation of these zones will be considered an act of war. Additionally, you will cease all hunting of wolves within your territory, and you will allow safe passage for any Wolfborn who wish to travel through the lowlands." The terms were harsh, and Aerys saw the struggle on Torvund's face as he weighed them. But he was a pragmatist, and he knew that refusal would mean the continuation of a war he could not win. "Agreed," he said finally, his voice bitter. "We will abide by these terms." Rhaegorn inclined his head, and he gestured for one of his warriors to bring forward a ceremonial blade. "Then let us seal this truce with blood, as is the custom of both our peoples." The ritual was simple but binding. Torvund and Rhaegorn each cut their palms, their blood mingling on the ground between them, and they spoke the words of the oath in unison, their voices echoing through the clearing. When it was done, the tension in the air eased slightly, though the distrust remained. Torvund turned to leave, but before he could, Aerys called out to him. "Torvund," she said, and he stopped, looking back at her with an expression of contempt. "I know you hate me for what I have done," she said, "but I made my choice, and I do not regret it. I hope the Vale finds peace, and I hope you can lead your people to a better future." Torvund stared at her for a long moment, and then he spat on the ground at her feet. "You are dead to us," he said. You betrayed your own kind, and you will carry that shame for the rest of your days." He turned and walked away, the human delegation following, and Airless watched them go, feeling the finality of that rejection settle into her bones. She had known it would come to this, but the reality of it was still painful, a severing of ties that could never be repaired. Rhaegorn placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," he said quietly. "You chose to protect the innocent, to stand against hatred and fear. That is not betrayal. That is courage." Airless leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his presence, and together they returned to the stronghold, the truce holding but the future still uncertain. The days following the truce were a time of cautious optimism. The Wolfborn celebrated the end of immediate hostilities, but they remained vigilant, aware that peace was fragile and could shatter at any moment. Rhaegorn used the respite to strengthen alliances with the other wolf clans, traveling to distant territories to negotiate and persuade. Airless accompanied him on many of these journeys, and she saw firsthand the respect and fear he commanded among his people. But she also saw the loneliness that haunted him, the way he held himself apart even from those who admired him, and she understood that his position as Alpha King was both a crown and a cage. Their relationship continued to deepen, becoming something more than alliance or attraction. They spent long hours together, talking about their pasts, their fears, their hopes for the future. Rhaegorn told her of the wars he had fought, the losses he had endured, the moments when he had come close to breaking under the weight of his responsibilities. Airless shared her own stories, of growing up in the Vale, of the abuse and neglect she had suffered, of the moment she had chosen to save the cub and set herself on this path. They found solace in each other, a connection that transcended the differences between their worlds, and Airless realized that she had fallen in love with him, not because he was a king or a protector, but because he was a man who carried his burdens with grace and refused to compromise his principles. But their happiness was short-lived. 2 months after the truce, word reached the stronghold that the human militias had violated the terms. A group of hunters had entered the neutral zone and killed a young wolfborn who had been traveling alone. The news ignited a firestorm of rage among the pack, and the council convened immediately, their voices raised in demands for retaliation. Rhaegorn listened to their arguments, his expression dark, and when he finally spoke, his voice was edged with steel. "The humans have broken the truce," he said. "They have shown that their word means nothing, and they must face the consequences. We will respond, but we will do so strategically. We will not allow our anger to drive us into reckless action." He turned to Airless, and she saw the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between his desire for peace and the necessity of justice. "I need you to go back to the Vale one last time," he said. "I need you to find out if this was an isolated act or part of a larger plan. If it is the former, we may be able to contain the damage. If it is the latter, we will have no choice but to go to war." Airless felt her stomach drop, knowing that this mission would be even more dangerous than the last, but she nodded. "I will go," she said. "But I need your promise that you will not act until I return with information. Do not let your anger push you into something you cannot take back." Rhaegorn was silent for a long moment, and then he nodded. "You have my word," he said. "But if you do not return within 3 days, I will assume the worst, and I will not hold back." Airless left the stronghold that night, traveling alone through the mountains, her heart heavy with dread. She reached the Vale by dawn, moving through the settlement with the stealth she had learned during her time with the Wolfborn, and she sought out Sarah, the young woman who had served as the emissary. She found her in a small shack on the outskirts of the settlement, and Sarah's eyes widened in shock when she saw Airless. "You should not be here," Sarah whispered, glancing nervously toward the door. "Torvon has declared you an outlaw. If anyone sees you, they will kill you on sight." Airless ignored the warning and stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I need to know what happened in the neutral zone," she said. "Was it an accident, or was it deliberate?" Sarah hesitated, her expression torn, and then she sighed. "It was Torvin," she said quietly. "He ordered a group of hunters to kill the Wolfborn as a test, to see if the wolves would retaliate. He never believed in the truce. He only agreed to it to buy time to prepare for another assault. Airless felt a cold fury settle over her. "How many know about this?" she asked, and Sarah shook her head. "Most of the settlement is unaware. Torvin has kept it secret, but there are whispers, and people are starting to ask questions. He is planning to launch an attack within the week, before the wolves can respond to the killing." Airless thanked Sarah and left, her mind racing. She had the information Rhaegorn needed, but she also knew that she could not leave without taking action. If Torvin launched his attack, the fragile peace would be destroyed, and countless lives would be lost on both sides. She made her way to the common hall where Torvin held court, and she slipped inside through a side entrance, moving silently through the shadows. She found him alone in a back room, studying a map spread across a table, and she stepped out of the darkness, her knife drawn. Torvin whirled around, his hand going to his sword, but Airless was faster, pressing the blade to his throat before he could draw. "You broke the truce," she said, her voice cold. "You killed an innocent, and now you plan to start a war that will destroy everything." Torvin's eyes blazed with hatred, but he did not move, the knife too close to his jugular. "The Vale will never bow to beasts," he spat. "I would rather die fighting than live under their shadow." Airless pressed the blade harder, drawing a thin line of blood, and she leaned in close. "Then you are a fool," she said, "because your pride will be the death of everyone you claim to protect." She pulled the knife away and stepped back, and Torvin lunged for his sword. But before he could reach it, the door burst open, and a group of Torvin's men rushed in, weapons drawn. Airless knew she could not fight them all, and she turned to run, but one of the men grabbed her, his grip like iron, and she was thrown to the ground. Torvin stood over her, his face twisted with rage, and he raised his sword. "You will die here," he said, "and your death will be the spark that ignites the fire." But before he could strike, the room exploded into chaos. Rhaegorn appeared, his wolf form crashing through the wall, and behind him came a wave of wolf-born warriors, their presence overwhelming and terrifying. Rhaegorn shifted to his human form, standing between Airless and Torvin, and his voice was like thunder. "You have violated the truce. You have threatened what is mine, and now you will face judgment." Torvin's men fell back, terrified, and Torvin himself stood frozen, his sword trembling in his hand. Rhaegorn did not wait for a response. He disarmed Torvin with a single brutal strike, sending the sword clattering to the floor, and he lifted the man by his throat, his strength inhuman. "I could kill you now," Rhaegorn said, his voice low and deadly. "I could destroy this settlement and everyone in it as punishment for your treachery. But I will not, because that would make me no better than you." He threw Torvin to the ground, and he turned to address the men who had gathered in the hall, drawn by the commotion. "The truce is broken," he said, "but I offer you one final chance. Surrender Torvin to my justice, agree to new terms, and I will spare the Vale. Refuse, and I will raze this place to the ground and salt the earth so that nothing ever grows here again." The people of the Vale looked at each other, their faces pale with fear, and then one by one, they stepped away from Torvin, leaving him alone and defenseless. Torvin screamed in rage, but no one came to his aid, and Rhaegorn gestured for his warriors to take him. "He will face trial among the Wolfborn," Rhaegorn said, "and his fate will serve as a warning to any who think to break their word." He turned to Airless, who was still on the ground, bruised and shaken, and he helped her to her feet, his hands gentle despite the violence that had just unfolded. "You should have waited for me," he said, his voice rough with emotion, and Airless managed a weak smile. "I could not let him start another war," she said, "not when there was a chance to stop it." Rhaegorn pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, and she felt the tremor that ran through his body, the fear and relief that he had arrived in time. "If I had lost you," he said quietly, "I do not know what I would have done." They returned to the stronghold with Torvin as their prisoner, and the Wolfborn celebrated their victory, but the mood was somber. The conflict had taken its toll, and everyone knew that the peace they had achieved was tenuous at best. Rhaegorn convened the council to decide Torvin's fate, and after much debate, it was decided that he would be exiled to the farthest reaches of the mountains, stripped of his authority and left to survive on his own. It was a harsh sentence, but it was also merciful, and it sent a clear message that the Wolfborn valued justice over vengeance. In the aftermath, Rhaegorn worked to rebuild the relationship between the Wolfborn and the humans of the Vale. New terms were negotiated, with representatives from both sides meeting regularly to address grievances and prevent future conflicts. Aerlis played a crucial role in these efforts, serving as a bridge between the two worlds, and slowly, cautiously, a new understanding began to emerge. It was not perfect, and there were still those on both sides who harbored hatred and distrust, but it was a beginning. Rhaegorn and Aerlis's relationship became public knowledge, no longer hidden, but openly acknowledged, and while it provoked controversy, it also became a symbol of the new era they were building. They stood together as partners, leading the Wolfborn into an uncertain future, and Aerlis finally found the sense of belonging she had searched for her entire life. She was no longer the orphan from the Vale, no longer the outsider struggling to survive. She was Aerlis Morvayn, consort to the Alpha King, and she had earned her place through courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to what was right.